Hello everyone, I'm Dead Knight and this is In It to Win It. Today we are going to talk about one of the core concepts in the Hearthstone game, which is RNG. Is it good for the game? Is it bad for the game? Why do people hate it? Why do people love it? And what do you think? So I'm going to start jumping right into my thesis, which is that RNG is the best thing about Hearthstone, and I don't want it to ever go away, and I think it is the defining thing that makes Hearthstone such a great game. So that's a pretty hot take for some people, but let's get right into it. So the reason that I think RNG is the best part of this game is because it is the ultimate equalizer. It keeps every part of the game fresh and it makes the game unpredictable, but mostly in a fun and sometimes zany way that makes it different from other games. Basically, if you don't like RNG in a game, then you shouldn't play a game that starts you off with a randomized deck of 30 cards that could come in any order. So there's always going to be some element of RNG to this game because you're drawing your random deck. You might not get your best card until the last card in your deck and lose from RNG even if none of the cards had RNG aspects to it. So RNG stands for random number generator, which is the computer process that gets you a random effect from something happening. This was a key part of World of Warcraft already, so going back to the source material, it makes sense that we have RNG in here. But let's talk about how this game has been shaped by RNG and what people's reactions were at the time. So the first instance of RNG that I can think of from Hearthstone that was bringing up discussion was Piloted Shredder. This is a 4/3 for 4, and when it dies, you get a random 2-cost minion. So this was one of the strongest minions in the game at the time it came out in the Goblins vs. Gnomes expansion, because you have a 4/3 for 4, which is not great stats, lower stats than Chill Wind Yeti, but you get that 2-cost minion. So sometimes they kill your 4/3, and out from the driver's seat of the shredder pops another one, and you get a succubus, which is a 4/3. And this was really frustrating people. Or sometimes even worse, Millhouse Manastorm pops out of the driver's seat and you get a 4/4. So people would be killing the shredder and then basically have to deal with the same thing all over again, and they were just rage quitting. It was crazy. And then sometimes you kill the shredder and a doomsayer is driving it, and the person who has a really aggressive deck with the shredder loses their whole board. Sometimes Nat Pagle pops out and you are left with no attack. So sometimes Novice Engineer pops out, you get a 1/1, and you're really counting on a minion that had at least 2 attack or 2 health. So the Shredder giveth and the Shredder taketh. But mostly people felt like the Shredder was doing a lot of the giveth, and they were complaining about how broken this card was. I think that that is one of the great things about this game, uh, because anyone can win a match if something like that goes right or wrong. You could be playing against a pro and have a chance to come out on top, which obviously we hear a lot of pros dislike this, because pros will usually say something to the effect of, well, I am so good at this game, if only there wasn't RNG holding me back, then I would be unstoppable and I'd be winning everything, but it's always these low rolls that come in and steal the game from me. Well, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that anyone has a chance to win any game, because we've seen games that are like Hearthstone where you don't have that RNG, and you have the same pool of pros that win, but it's not the same player that wins every time. So you still have a fresh pool of winners, but the games are not rock paper scissors in Hearthstone the way they are in, say, Magic the Gathering. Since Magic is usually played face to face with a physical deck of cards, you can't get these piloted shredder type cards where you get random things generated to that scale. In Magic, usually the randomness is flipping a coin or rolling the dice, which is a pretty low level of RNG with only a couple outcomes. Piloted Shredder had, 100 outcomes, so you could always keep it fresh. But what do we see in Magic when we don't have that wild RNG? We see rock, paper, scissors in the meta sometimes. If you show up with one deck and your opponent shows up with the other deck, the outcome is sometimes foreordained, and there's almost no way that you can come out on top if you have the rock to someone else's paper. So I don't think that's fun for the game. It's not fun to show up and immediately know that you're going to win or lose. We see that a little bit in Hearthstone. There's some matches that are almost unwinnable. For example, Control Priest versus Ticketus, almost unwinnable. If you see that matchup is happening, sometimes you'll see people just concede right away. It's amusing, but it's not fun. So RNG is something that takes that out. But let's talk about how that has progressed and whether or not there are some legitimate issues. So this conversation came up again in Madness at the Dark Moon Fair when the Yogg-Saron Master of Fate came out. So the Yogg-Saron Master of Fate takes this to its natural conclusion of absurdity with RNG. There are 6 different effects that can happen when you spin the wheel. One of them literally ends the game right then and there by casting Rod of Roasting and pyroblasting everything on the board until a player loses. So that literally ends the game in favor of one person or another. And so this is when the crying really began hard and saying, Yogg-Saron is totally busted, RNG is totally stupid, and games shouldn't be decided by the roll of the dice. Well, if you feel that way, then you shouldn't play a 10 mana card that requires you to also play 10 spells before you activate it. So that sequence is a huge investment. If a person wants to build their deck and let Yogg take the wheel and decide the game for them, they are counting on living to turn 10 and playing 10 spells and getting Yogg out and having it do its thing. So those decks that need a card like Yogg to win are still going to have pretty low win rates. So I'm okay with losing a random game to Yogg, but beating that deck 75% of the time. I think that balances out, because you are also possible. It's also possible for you to lose to a high roll to another card that isn't so egregiously in your face RNG. So in that context, you have to think that the amount of different random numbers that are generated by this game means that any one high roll from one card can bounce out the low roll of another card, unless you have something like Yogg. But that's a huge investment of resources to rely on Yogg. And a lot of times you don't live to turn 10 because of a more lethal, more efficient deck that has fewer high roll, low roll swings in RNG will beat you. So I think that is a totally fair outcome if someone wants to rely on a card like Yogg to save them, because more often than not, it won't save them. But that brings us to what some people consider a more problematic outcome, which is what we saw when Forge and the Barons came out, and we had a highly reduced pool of cards and a series of cards that potentially had very powerful RNG effects. The 2 I'm going to talk about now are the 2 that ended up getting nerfed, which were Jandis Barav and Deck of Lunacy. So Deck of Lunacy would take your entire mage deck of spells and turn them into random spells that cost 3 more mana but had the same amount of overall mana cost. So for example, your Font of Power for 1 mana would turn into a Fireball for 1 mana. So that's extremely powerful, huge edge from that mana reduction, and the deck ended up being the top deck in the format until they made Deck of Lunacy cost 2 more. So people blame RNG for this, but the problem here was actually not RNG. The problem here was abusing the low card pool. So anytime you had a 6 mana spell on your deck, like Mask of Cthulhu that got reduced by Incanter's Flow, or that was really what most people were doing. But if you had any 6 mana spell, there's only one 9 mana spell in the pool, which was Libram of Hope, which is really good, especially really good at 6 mana, as we know from playing against Libram. So if all of a sudden you play this card, on turn 3 after an Incanter's Flow, and now you have 3 Librams of Hope in your deck. That's pretty crazy. That's not random. Uh, the other card that was really abusing this pool was Nagrin Slam. If you didn't reduce those 7 mana spells, then your spells would either turn into Nagrin Slams, which would give you uh, 4 3/5 minions that stick to the board and randomly attack things when they come in, or you get Survival of the Fittest. So people would have a mage deck that has a ton of burn in it that also has 3 Nagrin Slams in it. Again, this is not random because you only had 2 options, and one of them was a crazy good option that would just roll people over. So the abuse of this was not because it was random, it was because it wasn't random. The same thing was happening with Jandis Barav. You play a 5/5, or sorry, you play a 5 mana for 2/1, you get 2 more 5/5s. The pool of 5/5s is small. A lot of them are rush minions. Some of them are, Earth Elemental. Some of them suck. So, every now and then you get a Blood Herald, which is just a basic 1/1. So, there was some counterbalance to it. But the problem with Jandis was that people would play this on turn 4 or turn 5, and then they would shadow step it and play it again. So there were more cards that were good than there were bad. So, you had a better chance of getting quality cards, but you get to do it so often. So again, the problem is not the random generation from the card itself, it's the abuse by playing it over and over at reduced costs. Or in Deck of Lunacy, the abuse is that you play the card and you're not really generating random numbers. And because those cards ended up being problematic, they got nerfed. So that's the thing that gives me comfort about this, is if there ever is a random number generation that is either not random enough or somehow otherwise gets abused, Blizzard can step in and fix this, and and make it so that everything balances out again. But in the process, along the way, we get to have these kind of experiences that we can't get with any other game, which is the spinning of the wheel, which is seeing random minions get generated, giving any deck a chance to beat another deck, and remembering the investment that comes with relying on something that swings the game wildly. If you don't like it, there are ways to make your deck pretty consistent, but there's always going to be some randomness. Discover a card, for example, is pretty random. You don't realize just how many bad spells and bad minions are out there until you try to discover one. So right now we feel it a little bit more acutely than normal because the card pool is lower. So when Priest discovers spell after spell after spell, and it tends to be the same spells over and over, it feels really frustrating. But as more cards get released, we'll see that that'll start to balance out. But also, you have to remember that while Priest is discovering spell after spell after spell, that's resources that they're playing that aren't always affecting the board. Renew is great because it restores 3 health for 1 mana and gets you a spell. But if you can't get a spell that deals with whatever's in front of you that's causing you to lose health, you're going to die no matter how many times you renew into palm reading, renew into palm reading, because ultimately you're not dealing with the threats. So yes, Priest has other ways to deal with the threats. That's why these cards feel like they're abusive, but you can't just discover over and over again without affecting the board, or you'll lose. So it doesn't matter how much resource generation you have if those resources aren't dealing with threats. So even that absurd generation from Priest, I think, is fair because they still have to weave answers in with those discoveries. So that is how I would sum up RNG. You have the few main issues right now that are making it feel tough, which is the low card pool, really the low card pool, and the abuse of playing cards more than once when they're not supposed to be played more than once. Those are the main issues. But otherwise, RNG, I think, mostly balances itself out by giving you high rolls and low rolls in the same game from multiple sources, and Also, it makes the game fun. It makes for some wacky outcomes, and it makes you really have to think twice before you rely on it or say it's too powerful, because every now and then, oh my yog turns your game upside down in a good way or a bad way. So let's keep this unique thing about Hearthstone in the game. Let's lean into it like we've been doing. Let's keep it fun. And when we're designing card sets, let's try to get some 9 mana spells in there so that it's not just Libram of Hope every time. Um, do you agree? Do you disagree? I know that this is a little bit controversial and that there's a lot of people who hate RNG. Feel free to leave some respectful comments below about it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch the next part of this series, and tune in next time.